So here we are at In Quest for Truth by Irene Conybeare, and here's Mayor Karan starting the reading. Thank you.
Yeah. Chapter 12, Meher Baba's Teachings. People in India, as everywhere else, are hopelessly bewildered at the chaotic world situation, which appears to have so little genuine cooperation and so much animosity and rancor. They wonder also how it is that India, with her wonderful spiritual heritage, in the form of so many saints and masters, should have sunk so low. Many modern Indian thinkers, and particularly politicians, believe that the Hindu religion is at the root of the lack of sincerity, degradation, inactivity, carelessness, and want of interest in progress as a whole. At this moment, there is hardly a state in India that is not quarreling with another state, hardly a community that does not seem to be disputing about something or other, and the linguistic disputes seem never ending. India appears to have become a veritable babel of varying tongues, all because English is no longer allowed to be the one and only unifying tongue. For it was the English language that had the effect of bringing people together in the past. Nevertheless, India, in spite of her faults and deficiencies, is a great source of spiritual energy from which man's regeneration and inspiration for the new age must flow. She, of all countries, is the most fitted to lead humanity out of its present impasse into a real brotherhood of man. But because India is the center of spiritual gravity, and because of the tremendous regenerating power of the forces around the avatar, there is always tension. These remarks somehow remind me that when in California, I had the opportunity of several talks with a certain famous Indian sage. I remember how horrified he was at the time of the Stalin purge and how he lamented the prevailing wickedness of our age. Trying to console him, I remarked that everything would be changed when Meher Baba broke his silence, which his followers believe will be the divine manifestation that will give a spiritual push to the whole world and start the new dispensation. The sage turned on me somewhat heatedly and asked, how can any man speaking change the face of the world? But I retorted, Baba is not a man, he is God. That is, if you accept the theory of man's journey through creation and his ultimate perfectioning in human form, when he becomes a man god or a god man, in that case, then may it not be so difficult to believe that God can do and that Baba can change the world for the better? I continued, do you believe in this theory? Of course. I might have retorted that whatever bad mess there appeared to be was merely the reflection of the intellect of the day. He hesitated for a few minutes, saying he did not know, and then added, but all I can say is that if the masters do exist, then they have made a pretty bad mess of it. I have to admit that. Though India is as ever full of advanced souls, saints, and masters, And also that I believe an avatar has been born in Meher Baba's person, yet it is difficult for Westerners to see any signs of spiritual regeneration. This question must be answered by the masters themselves. We can only wait and see. I am sometimes asked by both Westerners and Easterners why the teachings of the great spiritual leaders of mankind should vary so much to the point of contradiction. In fact, it almost seems that they have no unity or pattern of expression. For instance, Buddha virtually ignored the idea of God and thought there was no permanent self. Whereas we know that Krishna thought quite the opposite, namely, the self is permanent and taintless. Then again, we have Muhammad, who categorically denied he was an incarnation. Such contradictions go too deep to be reconciled on any presumption other than their protagonists all spoke from the same spiritual level of consciousness. We can only comfort ourselves by trying to realize that once we can accept that all true spiritual teachings is of the inexpressible, such points are irrelevant to the ultimate truth which does not come and go and is far beyond Maya and the limitations of the human mind. It is our own error of perceptive, that gives these contradictions too much prominence. I have heard lectures on Buddhism preface their introductory remarks by the statement, there is no God. However, it appears that the Buddha did not really teach that there is no God. Passages which appear authentic could also be quoted to show that he made no hard fast rule of the view that there is no self. But since contrary passages to the later could equally well be quoted, and since this affirmation gives its radical shape to whatever atheist, to whatever antithesis we have to make between Hinduism and Buddhism, it may be best to say that the idea of God with a capital G was virtually ignored in India of Buddha's time, I mean, even in the India of today. But the Buddha makes mention of the gods and even of Brahma, the creator, in passages, sometimes of a stunning irony, which represent the purest of Hindu view. To quote from Sir Charles Eliot's masterly Hinduism and Buddhism quotation, thus, in the Kevada Sutta, he, in brackets Kutam, relates how a monk who was puzzled by a metaphysical problem applied to various gods and finally accosted Brahma himself in the presence of all his retinue. After the question, which was, where do the elements cease and leave no trace behind? Brahma replies, I am the great, the supreme, the mighty, the all seeing, the ruler, the lord of all, the controller, the creator, the chief of all, appointing to each his place, the ancient of days, the father of all, that are and ought to be. But, said the monk, I did not ask you, friend, whether you are indeed all you now say, but I ask you where the four elements cease and leave no trace. Then the great Brahma took him by the arm and led him aside and said, these gods think I know and understand everything. Therefore, I give no answer in their presence. But I do not know the answer to your question, and you had better go and ask the Buddha. End of quotation. Meanwhile, we should remember that a tradition firmly established in the ultimate position is found only in Hinduism, and there are various schools of thoughts, nevertheless, in the mother of all religions. but we have to accept that to our own limited judgment. Most of the acknowledged great teachers appear to fall short of the traditional teachings in various degrees. It is therefore useless to try to bring together such diversity of thought, especially as we know that following the death of a great master, his followers may build superstructures of dogma and ritual in which the inner realities become forgotten, vitiated, and lost. This has certainly happened in the case of Christianity, as revealed by research into Christian origins by the patristic scholars of this century. We know that it was as early as the second and third centuries that the original Gnostic interpretation of the baptism in the Jordan became openly condemned as heretical by Rome, and finally other Gnostic teachings in brackets, which were the real teachings of Jesus, became supplanted by the virgin birth legend. For the early church councils wanted to make Christianity essentially a Western religion, dominated and sponsored by Rome. It was therefore necessary to suppress all Eastern concepts. Although the esoteric teachings of Jesus came from the East, then again, how can we believe, for instance, that Jesus, a God realized man, could have been capable of the vindictive sayings attributed to him, such as ought to be found in the New Testament? Surely they were introduced by early church councils for the express purpose of frightening the people. There's no reason to suppose that the church could not have stooped to alter and misconstrue text for her own political convenience, especially as patristic research discovered that the Gospels were not written down before 70 to 120 AD and that original texts have been changed over and over again. As we know, in those days, manuscripts were laboriously written and each example had to be copied afresh. The result being that copies soon departed from their originals, being added to, rewritten, and recast by further writers who had no objection to what we today would call plagiarism. Nevertheless, though Bertrand Russell and his ilk must know of the unreliability of parts of the Gospels, they contrive to capitalize on unfortunate sayings and question the virtue of Jesus and his teachings as a whole in the attack on Christianity. This type of intellectual iconoclast never troubles to go to the root of the matter or to keep an open mind. His conceit is so great that he dares not investigate for fear of losing his authority. He has no real interest, honesty, and makes a living out of destroying all that is sacred for other people. No doubt readers can, in the main, agree that the Sadguru, that is, man become God in the proper sense, does not come back. For he has established through his initiation of God realization or union with the self, his identity with the unborn, the permanent, with truth, in which there is no coming or going. But when it comes to the thesis that the avatar, that is God become man, comes again and again for the redemption of mankind, there is, so I understand, much in some aspects of Hinduism which disagrees with such a concept. If we read the message of Krishna, we are comforted to find that the author A.S. Vadia writes Hindu scriptures are filled with disquisitions on the doctrine of the avatar. All their systems of philosophy and religion recognize the periodical involution and dissolution of world process as representing the systole and diastole of the one universal heart, which is ever active and yet ever at rest. Though the universal heart lives and beats in all, it lives and beats in a special degree in the rishis and the Buddhas, the prophets, and the messiahs.
Thanks, Mayor. Marianne, could you unmute and continue? Marianne?
Yes. When the downward materialistic tendency holds sway over the lives and ideals of men, these great souls appear on the scene and redress the balance and thereby restore peace and righteousness on earth. On the point of the descent of the Lord, Krishnaic Hinduism is broadly at one with Trinitarian Christianity. The only difference between the two being that while the Hindus believe that Krishna, for the time being, was the one immediate and complete manifestation of immanent Brahma on earth, the Trinitarian Christians aver that Christ was the only one of three co-equal manifestations of God. Not being a scholar and incapable of arguing the various pros and cons, I am content to accept what Mr. Wadia writes, which agrees with my own views, such as they are. We should, however, remember that there are Western writers today who seek notoriety by debunking Eastern spirituality. Such writers are always superficial and quite unacquainted with the inner teachings of Eastern mysticism and yoga. Arthur Koestler is one of these superficial writers. His recent book, The Lotus and the Robot, from what I have read of it from reviews, suggests that he is still a communist at heart and uses the main tenets or tactics as perpetuated by communists who work for the defamation and degradation of all religious ideas and ideals, such as are held sacred by non-communists. We just have to ignore such destructive writers. I repeat that. We just have to ignore such distractive writers and try to remember that the essential is to understand that the real teaching is, as always, of the inexpressible, which does not admit of any disagreement, while all other teachings only lead up to this end and being strictly ad hominem do not call for agreement. A teacher may make diametrically opposite statements to different disciples with the same intention of taking him beyond words and thought, or indeed to the same principle on different occasions. A classic example of both cases is found in Prajapati's teachings to the gods and to the Asuras as described in the Chandogya Upanishad. As to the Hindus in general, whether they believe in avataric manifestations or whether they do not, it may be observed that they are often very matter-of-fact in discussing their most sacred texts, only insofar as these patently serve to take one beyond the phenomenal have they indisputable authority. So we shall have to leave it at that. But the most important teaching of all, in which all the masters have concurred, is the influence of divine love. They give out an all-embracing love to humanity and are the most selfless beings of their day. They all teach that comfort, wealth, possessions, pain, and pleasure are but the fleeting impressions of a mind immersed in Maya. They saw their own selves embodied in all. They felt the happiness and unhappiness of all, not only of men, but of the subhuman species as well, because of their realization that the divine self is immanent in all. There is a delightful little volume, Little Flowers, an anthology of Atmavidya, or Life in the Spirit, compiled by Sri T.L. Vaswani, which shows how thoughts and sayings, gathered like flowers from the gardens of the masters, are intrinsically the same, whether they be from Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, or others. In them, we discover the truths that take us beyond any individual teachings. Such God-men started the new dispensation of their times in a flood of divine love. A descent of the Christ consciousness always takes place from time to time when the planet has, quote, run down and needs refueling with God's energy of love. As we are now at the end of a cycle, tremendous changes must come before our tired and tortured earth becomes replenished with the divine energy that will and must start a new dispensation to bring in the golden age to be. This brings me again to Hindu metaphysics, and I feel that I can best express what India stands for by paraphrasing a part of one of S. Dikshit's, I think it's called, editorials in that admirable little periodical, Chaitanya, devoted to the enlightenment of man. Should I read that asterisk? Oh, it's published by Chaitanya Bombay. Right. To understand the mission of India, we must think of her in the context of the world today and not as a rather isolated geographical and political entity. One might say that India has a way of life that cuts across all frontiers and embraces the whole of humanity at a certain level of consciousness. In fact, her religion, philosophy, and culture, in their widest sense, represent the universality of all that is good in man and teach that he has limitless consciousness and is not a finite creature. The keystone of Indian thought can be described in the term Sat Chit Ananda, which means all-powerful existence, knowledge, and bliss. India stands for the complete identification of the true and the beautiful with subjective knowledge, the sequence of karma, which is purely ethical in nature. Indian thought, therefore, in its totality, is not only the most harmonious combination, but also a noble culmination of all the eternal verities of life. Indian thought postulates man as the symbol of the supreme divinity. It discovers the infinite and thus rejects the differences between man and man as only phenomenal and artificial and not ultimately real. The Vedanta philosophy asserts that the final enlightenment leads to transcendental knowledge, the expression of the ultimate reality, which is basically one and the same everywhere and at all times. Recognition of phenomena leads to differentiations, denials, and disputes. Phenomenalism in thought is analytical negativism. Recognition of the ultimate reality as the basis of all is a positive attitude that leads to synthesis, to absolute reality. Therefore, what is here and there, now and then, this and that, all at the same time, is the supreme reality. In other words, reality of its very nature must transcend phenomena, that is, all differences, denials, and disputes. Advanced Vedantic thought goes a step further and postulates phenomenal existence as hallucinatory and mithya, which is Maya. The essence of this postulation is not a denial of the material existence that we experience from day to day in practical life, but an intellectual endeavor for the correct understanding of the true nature of reality. It is an endeavor to synthesize the differences in the apparent multiplicity. It is the glorification of the phenomenal into the abstract ultimate reality. Thus, the foundation of Indian thought transcends all phenomenal differentiation, and on it is built the superstructure of a universal unity between man, and even man and beasts and birds and things. The above is completely in accord with Meher Baba's teachings, and to establish this all-embracing unity of thought is the mission of the Master, and it is India that has to fulfill this sacred role, for she is more fitted than any other country by her lofty aspirations ensouled in her ancient life, which will be worked out through the awakening of men to a higher state of consciousness, a new vibration bringing harmony rather than discord into our relation with one another. We are in good company with Professor Toynbee in his insistence that the restoration of religion is the greatest need of the hour. He has made it clear that religion is the pivot of documental history, and that true culture is the essence of civilization. He deplores the spiritual vacuum in the West and condemns the exclusive mindedness of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He extols the Hindu religion's spirit for its Catholicity, universalism, and many-sidedness. For according to Dr. Toynbee, exclusive-minded religions breed self-centeredness and result in the growth of a collective ego, which, as we see in the world of today, is the source of all strife. Unless self-centeredness is overcome, man cannot attain his full spiritual stature, and no religion that does not efface, or at least curb, the self-centeredness can claim to be truly spiritual in the widest, deepest, and loftiest sense. Dr. Toynbee's concluding remark states, quotes, "The missions of the higher religions are not competitive. They are complementary. We can believe in our own religion without having to feel that it is the sole repository of truth. We can love it without having to feel that it is the sole means of salvation.
Thank you,
End
Mary.
quote.
Thank you, Mary. Now I'll take a turn now. All the great world religions today are expecting the imminent return of their founders. The idea of a new spiritual dispensation or second advent is not peculiar to the Christian faith, but at the same time, there is no proper understanding of this belief. For if the religious authorities of no matter what faith are called upon to explain just what they mean by the expected return of their founder and how they will recognize him, they will be unable to give an intelligible reply. Of all the official religions in this age, only Krishnaic Hinduism openly acknowledges and recognizes the part played by the avatars, God men, and the Sadgurus, men gods, in their hidden direction of world affairs. So how can people be expected to appreciate Meher Baba's proclamation that he is the avatar? Such a concept being entirely foreign to their philosophical and religious outlook. We must leave the vindication of Baba's mission to posterity. He has said that in 50 to 60 years' time, the whole world will have recognized him. So there is not long to wait. Our children and grandchildren will know. It is difficult really to know what the hidden teachings of the great masters were, for they have become lost and misinterpreted with the passage of time. But we know that Jesus taught that there was only one God, whom he called Father. He taught that by service to our fellow creatures, we could learn that we were all one with the Father and that we all had to become perfect. Jesus certainly never taught that he was the only Son of God. It is here that the Christian missionaries make such a mistake, alienating their hearers, who would otherwise be more sympathetic to the great and selfless work that they do in India and elsewhere. One might say that the marvel of Christianity is that, in spite of continuous distortions created by men of the church who were far from being God realized beings, the belief in the immanence of God has persisted, and all true devotees of Christ can discern the living presence of God. Would that we Christians were as tolerant as the great Mogul Akbar, a great scholar, and at the same time an illiterate, for he could neither read nor write. In the 16th century, at a time of religious strife in Europe, the Muslim conqueror of India built a city named Fatehpur Sikri, the city of victory. Over the great portals of the mosque was inscribed, quote, "So said Jesus, upon whom be peace," end quote. The world is a bridge, pass over it and build no house upon it. Excuse me, that middle end quote shouldn't have been there. So said Jesus, upon whom be peace. The world is a bridge, pass over it and build no house upon it. Baba teaches that irrespective of what religion a man believes in, provided he has sufficient faith, he will attain to knowledge of God, if not in his present life, then in another. Jesus knew when he said, quote, "Seek and ye shall find," end quote. Hafiz said, "Ask, ask, and ask again, and you shall not wish in vain. Keep on asking, And I swear to you by God that even though you ask for God himself, you will have him. This is not the place for an outline of Meher Baba's philosophy, for the scope of this book forbids it. But I may recall his oft repeated declaration that he has come not to teach, but to awaken. The teachings, as already indicated, can be found in full detail in the Master's discourses. Also, in that already mentioned unique work dictated by Meher Baba, God Speaks. No other teacher in our time or in any known past age so minutely analyzed consciousness. So, this great book is of paramount importance at all stages to all thinkers interested in the spiritual evolution of man. As Baba says, this I am of the ego self continues from the beginning of evolution as the soul, with ever increasing consciousness, identifies itself with each different form adopted in the course of its progress towards self realization. For the ultimate supreme consciousness of the soul's I amness is reached when it becomes one with the oversoul, this self identification being the final goal of its existence. This brings to mind the late Dr. Pierre Lecomte de Nouilly, the distinguished French biologist whose book, Human Destiny, created such a widespread interest. He declared that a scientific interpretation arrives at the idea of God as a logical necessity, and so helps to pave the way for a future reconciliation between natural science and metaphysical religion. He writes, but we must remember that we ignore and probably shall always ignore everything of the relations between the mysterious and hypothetical universe created by our logic and genius, with the help of the elements furnished by the deforming mirror of our senses, and the real, silent, colorless universe. With all respect to the professor, I venture to say that this statement applies to imperfect man who has a clear and underformed mirror of the senses. Until we can regard reality as non sensate, non material, eternal being and life, and the ego as an illusion or false conditioning which has to be transcended, we can never appreciate the true nature of man or how he was made according to the Bible in God's image and likeness and given dominion over all things. But when he has transcended the limitations of the human mind, which belong to his illusory consciousness or false ego, and has become self or God realized or God conscious, he will not ignore his relations with the universe, but will know it. A man who has attained self realization or union with the oversoul, and after that has regained human consciousness, knows that time is a limited concept belonging to his objective or evolutionary consciousness. Such a God plus man conscious state, as has just been depicted, can only be faintly reflected in the phantasmagoria of creation. It is this ignorance of the infinite self within and without that constitutes Maya. It may be described as the belief in one's false or illusory ego, as opposed to the universal and infinite life of our divine ego. When the false ego is itself annihilated, or better to say, when the false ego is transformed into the God consciousness real I, then all earthly and heavenly dwellings are not vacated. They simply cease to exist, even as illusion, for we cannot measure the immeasurable. The unreal hath no being. The real never ceaseth to be. The truth of both can be seen by the seers of the essence. That's from the Bhagavad Gita 2:16. The seers are perfect masters or God realized beings. One cannot think of any divisions in the soul, since the spirit is indivisible. For the spirit is in everything and is God, and whatever he may be or what he may not be, he is always infinitely indivisible. And thus, we have to just justify the reality of the world and at the same time, the illusion of the world as compared with the ultimate reality. A perfect master, a Sadguru or Kutub, as he is known in the East, is one who, by virtue of the evolution of the consciousness of his soul, has attained perfection or liberation from the round of births and deaths to which ordinary man is subject. But the avatar, out of compassion for humanity, reincarnates again and again in his work of perfecting the human race. A Sadguru is one, like the avatar, who has also transcended Maya. That is, one who has finished with the limitations of his false or limited ego. And in being one with the consciousness of the Oversoul, enjoys all its attributes, such as wisdom, power, knowledge, bliss, and divine love. But he does not reincarnate again, but remains forever immersed in God, the Oversoul. Meher Baba once, when explaining his state of God consciousness, said, just as matter does not exist in your dreams, so it does not exist for me when I am awake. What you experience in your sound sleep with regard to matter, a God realized man experiences in the waking state. My waking state is real, yours is false. When you realize God, you will see this for yourself, provided you regain consciousness of the gross world. Meher Baba has explained the above statement in his discourses, from which the following may be quoted. In the case of the perfect master, the conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is final and permanent, and therefore his state of self-knowledge is continuous and unbroken, and remains the same at all times without diminution. From this, you can see that the perfect master never sleeps in the ordinary sense of the word. When he rests his body, he experiences no gap in his consciousness. So we'll continue here next week at the top of page 224.
Did you miss a para? Can you show the last page?